Good morning, Sun Valley. Good morning to you all. Thanks for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Joshua Lincoln. I'm a fellow at the Center for International Law and Governance at the Fletcher School, interested in global affairs broadly. I serve on the board of directors of the Global Governance Forum, which is a digital think tank on these same issues. And I do a little bit of advisory work with governments and companies and institutions in some of these areas as well. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my background, my story, but we don't have time. But we've been talking a lot about narrative and storytelling, so I came up with a compromise, which is a narrative enigma. I'm going to show you my story, and I'm not going to talk about it at all. And I'm glad to talk about it later when you and I, if you want to, have this conversation. But these are all places I've been and things I've done in the past. What I would like to talk about is the net zero transition. And when I talk to people about it, I often use the analogy of a ship, and I call it the global economy ship. And that ship has been on the same course, the carbon, the fossil fuel economy course, since the oil revolution, since really the industrial revolution. And planetary science, in this case the IPCC, called out that there was trouble ahead. There were rocks. And it took us a long time. We argued about it. This is my favorite slide on climate delay, climate denial. We had discussions about what happens when ships hit rocks. And eventually, though, we decided that it was better to turn. So the ship turned, and we came about onto essentially somewhere, I would say, between 2015 and 2021. Those would be the entry point of the pivot and the exit point of the pivot for the global economy. Having taken this new course, we're moving very fast. As you can see from this slide, I think it's eight, if we're counting governments, is about 200 ships. And everybody is now sailing and trying to make the same pivot. And this brings forward one of the great insights about this transition. It's both an act of common self-preservation. We're doing it to save ourselves. And at the same time, it's a pivot to a new race, a combination, a simultaneous race and a scramble. It's a race for the new technologies, it's a race for the materials that we need, and it's a scramble for a lot of the resources that will really condition who prospers and a little bit who suffers in the next era. And so my daughter would say, hashtag global frenemies as the motif here, which is we're seeing two modes of behavior at the same time. We're seeing competition and we're seeing cooperation, almost down to the hour. We're seeing it between states, but we're also seeing it because it's not just states, it's companies, it's cities, it's regions, it's governments, it's local governments. Everybody's trying to make this pivot and to adjust simultaneously. And so the sailing can get a little competitive. It can get a little rough, it can get a little dramatic, and it does. And there's the occasional casualty in this process. But we're still on this new direction. So as we set out on this new course, what do we see at the global level? I'm going to talk about two trends that we see which lead to a third. The first is a set of vulnerabilities. The transition will expose a set of states to unprecedented vulnerabilities and threaten social stability. You heard the case of the US. We're actually doing extraordinarily well here in this country. We have the assets, the capacity, the innovation, a lot of the brilliant minds in this room and elsewhere that are pushing that forward. You heard it in the previous conversation. But for many countries, they're facing a combination of really difficult circumstances. If you look at this slide, I'm trying to represent here the combination of the loss of 88% of global GDP, 92% of, or 88% of emissions, 92% of global GDP are now covered by net zero targets. I fully take the point that many of those targets are not where they should be. There's greenwashing and all the rest of it, but the big picture remains. From a global standpoint, in a very short period of time, we are accelerating on a sort of fundamentally new course. Of course, it's not one ship, is it? If we're counting state oil and gas revenue by states that use those revenues to provide social services, the dependence of their economies on that old economy of oil, their existing levels of indebtedness, their existing levels of development, you could represent that by GDP levels, whether or not those states are currently experiencing what's called state fragility or conflict. you can trace a series of these different issues. And I'll take the next, this is an excerpt from a table, a larger table, where I have about 50 states. This is just 10 I took out. And you can see from the columns some of these issues. So if you compare Nigeria and Norway and Russia and Qatar, for example, and you look at these series of variables, how much income the government is set to lose, what the dependence of their economy is from a fiscal standpoint on oil and gas, whether or not they have, according to that McKinsey study in the third column, whether or not they have the capacity, how exposed is their economy to making the deep transition that is required, the infrastructural transition that is required. And then you compare all that against GDP levels and all that against which other sort of unfortunate lists or difficult lists those countries are already on, whether they're on the heavily indebted list, whether they're on the fragile and conflict list, et cetera, that are held by various international organizations. In the aggregate, it gives you a picture of how difficult a trajectory this is for a whole number of countries. The second pattern is, we've heard a little bit about, is this sort of emergence of a new set of tensions or competitions associated with this new course that we're taking. You've heard about critical minerals. This is the classic example of this, but it is really a very interesting one. This slide highlights the extent to which your standard car today has about 30 kilos of critical minerals in it. An electric vehicle will take 200 kilos of it. So and those numbers increase as you go. Here you see the expected scaling of the need of those minerals and how much of those independently are needed, lithium versus cobalt, et cetera. These are the minerals that are most commonly used. Forgive me, I'm going to go fast through these because I need to clip them, but I can give them to you later. This is the most interesting slide from our perspective. It shows the geographical concentration of some of these minerals. In 15 countries, the little gray zone in each of those balls is the rest of the world on current production mineral by mineral. What this shows a much higher level of concentration, for example, lithium, relative to oil. You'll see it in this next slide. Previous slide. There we go. Never mind. We'll keep going with this one. This is the one that shows the growth in demand over time. In 2020, we're sort of doing okay. Current production is sort of meets current need. But 10 years out, 20 years out, the demand begins to far exceed the supply. In these different areas, people are talking about how to bridge that demand to supply gap. But today, that becomes the source of the competition that we're looking at. When you take those two things together, vulnerability and competition, what do we see? What are the implications of those? My interest is in global governance, institutions of global governance. So those are some of the things that I look at. The first thing is that finance is becoming both a battleground and a backbone of the transition. That's why today is devoted to finance. But we see it even more so at the global level. Financial actors, including the World Bank, the IMF, what are called the Bretton Woods institutions, the multilateral development banks, but also private finance represented in this room, and capital as a whole is returning to a level of importance, a level of primacy that we probably haven't seen since the end of World War II. In relative political institutions, fundamental decisions are moving over towards the financial bodies as we speak. A second development would be to look at how this is going to impact what are called international organizations. Existing international organizations are going to have their mandates and their dynamics affected, from the Security Council all the way down to the sub-regional level to specialized agencies like some of those listed here. In the last 10 years, the second development, we've seen the emergence of a whole bunch of new climate-related institutions. That process is probably going to continue, but we're going to also have to rationalize that. Right now, it's a little bit like herding cats, and we're going to go through a process of sort of pulling that together into a more meaningful, more coordinated system. The third thing I think you can say is based on the previous two trends, that we're going to see new institutions and new groupings of states emerge. People are talking about they're going to be mineral OPECs that are going to emerge around key minerals, for example. And you can see that states are organizing already around their vulnerabilities. To conclude, let's come back to the ship. Remember the analogy, it's possible for one ship to win the race, but to have defeated the other ships so badly, to have left the others so far behind that we run the risk of losing the regatta. And that is a little bit the question for any ship that seems to be doing well, as is ours here today, which is we have to keep thinking about the cooperation side of this for us all to succeed, because it's climate change. We only win if we all win. So, I borrowed this slide from the Systems Change Lab because I really liked point number 1 and point number 3. I'm all about reuse and recycling. And I think when you find good ideas or things that are well stated, it's worth taking them and acknowledging them in the process. The first is we have to return to the connection between climate and development goals. We can't lose sight of that connection. It's too fundamental for the rest of the world. We might be able to afford it, they can't. The extent to which we care about it is the extent to which we all succeed. The third point here is the role of climate finance, and we'll hear a lot about it. It's being discussed today in Paris over the next 2 days. I would say the system has yet to prove that it can work, and that should be of concern to all of us. Climate finance has yet to succeed. I will leave you with a final thought. I'm sorry it doesn't reflect very well in this one, but it's a thought on partnerships. And it arises out of some of my advisory work. I work with governments and with institutions, helping them understand some of these issues, where they're going, and the value of partnership with the private sector and with emerging technologies. Conversely, I talk to companies for them to understand the implications of their technologies and to better understand the sort of what I would call the global public policy circumstances. And I think that we have to move from current aid-based models of tech transfer, financial support, and partnership to more advanced, deeper models. And I would challenge everyone, all the brilliant minds in this room, everybody with a new technology or with funds to invest, to think through how we move far more explicitly towards co-development, co-ownership, co-management of existing technologies, new technologies, because absent that, I don't think that we're going to bridge the gap that is required. So I think I want to end on a hopeful note. This is not meant to be a gloom and doom overview. It's meant to raise to you the main concerns that are out there at present, the things that we see. But there's an enormous promise inherent in this moment as well. In sub-Saharan Africa, mobile technologies allowed vast regions to simply leapfrog. They never had a landline. They'd been unable to have a landline for decades. They went straight to mobile, and it transformed economies, it transformed societies. And I think the clean energy revolution, transformation, and the net zero transition affords opportunities that we have never seen to transition and to move large segments of the world forward at the same time as we move forward. So I'll leave you with that as a hopeful thought, but one with a practical challenge, which is I think every startup owner, every disruptor, every fund manager needs to think about these issues as well and to engage in the conversation around deeper forms of partnership. Thank you so much.